Tufting. The tufting process begins with creeling. In this process, cones of yarn are placed on a creel rack behind the tufting machine. Each yarn end is fed into a plastic tube affixed to the creel. These tubes run overhead and the yarn is fed from the tubes, down between the feed rolls and through the needles of the tufting machine. Creeling is time-consuming, but tufting from creels is more efficient for long production runs. Tufting is also done from beams. With this process, the yarn is placed on a small creel rack and 90 to 130 yarn ends are wound onto beams via a process called warping. Depending on the machine gauge, 10 to 16 beams are placed behind the tufting machine and the yarn is tufted directly from the beams. Beam tufting is preferred for short production runs and allows for quick changeovers. There is also very little yarn waste because each strand is about the same length. A tufting machine resembles a large sewing machine. A commercial machine with a standard 12-foot wide needle bar will have approximately 900 to 2,300 needles. Tufts of yarn are inserted into a woven or non-woven primary backing by the needles. The primary backing, usually woven polypropylene, is fed through the machine as the tufting process takes place. The main function of the primary is to provide a base cloth to hold the tufts in place until the coating process. As the needles penetrate the primary backing, a looper is inserted into the loop of yarn formed by each individual needle to hold it in place while the needle withdraws from the primary. The primary advances between needle penetrations, which determines the stitch rate of the product. This process results in a loop pile construction. If a cut pile is being tufted, the looper rocks back against a knife, cutting the tuft as the needle begins another downward stroke. The four variables which control the tufted construction are pile height, gauge, stitch rate, and yarn size. Pile height is the distance in inches from the surface of the product to the primary backing. Gauge is the needles per inch on the needle bar. Stitch rate is the number of needle penetrations per inch. Yarn size is the total denier of the yarn. Face weight is the amount of fiber in ounces per square yard. Density is determined by the four variables we just discussed and is calculated by multiplying the face weight in ounces by 36 and dividing the total by the finished pile thickness. Tufted patterns are created by proper yarn placement, needle bar or bars movement, and tension on the yarn. Let's look at two specific tufting machines, the 10th gauge graphics and the 12th gauge full repeat. 10th gauge graphics. Pattern carpets may be created with the use of several types of tufting machines. Some are capable of creating multicolored as well as multi-textured looks. Both the 10th gauge loop pile and cut pile graphics machines are driven by computer programs and can create patterns of varying face weights. The yarn placement, step diagram, and advance determine the pattern and its scale. The yarn placement or thread up specifies the position of each yarn at the needle. Since there are two needle bars, a step diagram indicates their independent movements, while the advance typically compensates for the stagger between the front and back needle bars. Pattern width is controlled by the thread up and step motion, while the stitch rate works with the step motion to control the length of the pattern. The 10th gauge graphics machine can accommodate a variety of yarn types. For cut pile patterns, either staple or filament yarn may be used. Gray goods may be tufted for piece-dyed patterns. This particular product uses two types of yarn that, when dyed, create a solid color background and a multicolored accent. Loop pile or tip-sheared patterns require the use of continuous filament yarn. Twelfth gauge full repeat. There are several versions of 12th gauge full repeat tufting machines. These machines control the feed of each yarn independently, allowing for pile height and texture variations to create patterns with a three-dimensional appearance. The full repeat machines can tuft both organic and geometric designs. The full repeat allows for pattern width up to 144 inches, or full width. Pattern length is dependent on computer memory availability. Many patterns are 10 feet or more in length. One machine features an 1/8 gauge needle bar fed from beams and a 1/4 gauge needle bar fed from a creel. Only the 1/4 gauge is full repeat. Typically, the 1/4 gauge would tuft at a slightly higher pile height to provide the dominant pattern, with the 1/8 gauge supplying the background coloration. A second option is the double 6 machine, with two 6 gauge needle bars fed from creels. Both needle bars have full repeat capability, allowing tremendous flexibility in pattern and texture. Next on our tour are post-dyeing operations for tufted gray goods.